Welcome to Camera Shake Podcast, episode 119, the podcast where we talk about photography, videography, and anything that's got anything to do with any of that. Now, let me just say this first. If you are listening to the audio version of this podcast, give us a few stars, leave a review. But also, you can hop over to YouTube where you can see this whole thing in full Technicolor as well. Anyway, so it's been a busy week. It's been a very busy week. Quite a few things that have been happening. There's been a really cool photo shoot that left me very hungry. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But also, the photography show is coming up in just under 2 weeks. So for those of you who are listening to this podcast from further afield, the photography show is the biggest photography and videography trade show in Europe at this point. So it's happening next weekend. I think it's the 17th, 16th to the 20th of September, something like that, in Birmingham at the NEC. We'll be there. Come and say hello if you see me or Nick traipsing about. Just come and say hello if you are listening. Otherwise, we'll be back next week. Anyway, so here we go. This week, like I said, it's been busy. I've had a very interesting photo shoot at the Craft Guild of Chefs, which was very interesting. It's an award they do every year, and it basically gives young chefs the opportunity to really, step up and present some incredible dishes. It was incredible. The whole thing was incredible. I'm completely flabbergasted by the amount of skill present in this building. There was a standard kitchen, and there was a pastry kitchen. And for anybody who's listening to this podcast who shoots food, how the hell do you do that? Like, how do you not get hungry when you photograph food? Oh, I don't know. It was tough. It was tough. Anyway, it's an interesting thing. Actually, let's talk about this photo shoot for a minute. It's one of these corporate type shoots that requires a number of different disciplines. So we had action shots of chefs preparing food in the kitchen. There were product shots, if you want to call it that, of the finished dishes, and of course there were headshots as well. So it was all happening. It's all wrapped into one event, and it all happened on this one day. So I mean, in terms of volume, it wasn't necessarily that bad. I think there was probably about 19 headshots to be done. That you can rattle those off relatively quickly, but yeah, photographing food for a whole day, it's a tough job. Anyway, so last week, or not last week, the week before last, I talked about a photo shoot that I did back in Germany. And as part of that, I was talking about light meters. And we had a few questions come in as far as light meters are concerned. So I thought this week, we're going to dedicate the whole thing to light meters versus histograms versus eyeballing. Do you use a light meter, or do you use a histogram to get the right exposure? Maybe you don't feel that you need to use a light meter because maybe you're shooting landscapes and using the histogram, that's fine for you. Maybe you do use a light meter. Then it'd be really interesting to hear from you and tell us what your experience is in terms of why you like using a light meter or why you think it's unnecessary. Anyway, so in order to get a correct, in inverted commas, exposure, there's 3 ways you can do that. One is you can use a light meter. You could use your histogram that has pros and cons, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But you could also just eyeball it, on the back of the screen or in the EVF, or if you're tethering on your computer screen. Now, each one of those methods comes with advantages and disadvantages, and in today's episode, I'll explore exactly where the pros and cons are for each one of those. Now, I'm going to start with the histogram, because the histogram is something that you find built in I would say probably all DSLRs and mirrorless cameras these days. So it's something I think most listeners would be familiar with. But if you're not, it's basically a graph on the back of the camera after you take an image that, or in the electronic viewfinder with mirrorless cameras, that basically maps the dark and bright pixels in the image. So if you imagine you get the dark pixels on the left and the brightest pixels on the far right, and you'll end up with a graph, and that really just displays, or displays what's happening in that picture. If you find that you have a lot of pixels toward the left side of the histogram, you know that your image is going to be slightly too dark, and if your pixels are bunched up on the right hand side of the histogram, then that indicates that your image is possibly too bright. So what you want is sort of a nice mountain range in the middle. And there are exceptions to that. I mean, one exception would be, for instance, if you're shooting headshots in a white background, where you're intentionally blowing out the background, you'd find a lot of pixels on the very, very far right of the histogram. And that is just how it is. So it comes with a caveat. So just looking at the histogram itself doesn't necessarily tell you whether the exposure is correct or not correct. I think it's relatively tricky to rely on that. It works well when you're shooting landscapes, maybe. In fact, when you're shooting with available light, it's a very useful tool. I mean, that's what it's there for. It just tells you what's happening. It basically lets you know whether you're blocking up the shadows or whether you're overexposing the highlights. Right? So it can be extremely useful for that. That becomes an issue when you're reproducing an image. So for instance, when you're printing an image and you've got your shadows blocked out and your highlights are blown out, then that's a problem in print, because it'll always come up looking like crap, basically. So the histogram itself doesn't consider color at all. It literally just maps the brightness of the pixels across the image. Again, like I said, everything outside of that is either blown out or blocked up. So like I said, in general, you want to keep your image somewhere in between. I think one of the main issues that I have with histograms is that it measures reflective light. So reflective light, if you imagine, light hits your subject, whatever it is that you're photographing, it might be a mountain or it might be a person, and then that light gets reflected off of that subject, and it then hits the sensor of your camera, and that is basically the light that the histogram is measuring, or that the camera is measuring. So what you're dealing with is really reflective light. So another disadvantage there could be, for instance, if you imagine if you're photographing your subject, let's say you're doing a portrait in front of a dark background, then the histogram will really show a lot of dark pigments. So it'll be a lot of dark pixels. It'll be very much bunched up towards the left side of the graph. That doesn't really reflect what's going on in the image. It just basically is an indication that you've got a lot of dark stuff happening in that image. And the problem with that is if you're trying to get a right exposure, if you imagine you're shooting a person in front of a dark background, what you're really exposing for is the face or the skin tone, and the histogram will give you it's almost like an incorrect reading of what's actually happening, and so you'd have a tendency to overexpose if you were just going for the histogram. What you'd have to do is you'd literally have to zoom in onto somebody's face, get the right exposure there, and then zoom out again. And that would then, the end result would be that the face would be correctly exposed and the background would appear dark. That's a bit of a pain in the backside, I guess. So in a portrait situation, I'm not sure that I would rely on histogram at all times. The histogram, however, and I have to say this, is really useful, again, when you're shooting with available light, and especially in concert photography type of situations where you're shooting, indoors, and you have to make use of the available light that's around you. The histogram can become very useful. The way I usually shoot in concert situations is that I shoot slightly underexposed. I know, controversial, whatever. That's how I do it. So I shoot about half a stop to a stop under, so I know that my pixels are going to be bunching up on the left-hand side, because I know that I have the flexibility in post to pull some of that detail back out of the shadows, and it also means that I'm not necessarily crucifying all the highlights in there. That's how I do it. Other people do it differently. If you shoot concerts and you have a different method, then get in touch. Would be really interesting, and maybe I'll have a chat with Anne Hess about that at some point in the future. But for me, that works. So it's sort of a tandem between, you know, the camera technology and post-production. When I shoot concerts, I just like doing it like that. I like the results that I get. And, you know, everybody seems to be happy, so it's all good. Now, there's an old rule that basically says you should always expose to the right, which means that, you know, you keep the details in the shadows and you expose slightly to the right. You know, there's a danger there that you're blowing out the highlights. I mean, the advantage there is that you might be able to reduce the overall noise in the image. I think with older cameras that would have been very useful because noise usually happens or appears in the shadows. So if you're keeping the shadows clean, then you know, you get a cleaner image, technically speaking. But you know, nowadays sensors are so good, I don't think you have to necessarily worry about that too much. Like I said, I do the other way around. I shoot slightly underexposed and I pull that detail back out of the shadows. And you know, on a very rare occasion that I have to run some noise reduction on it, so be it, it's fine, you know. But overall, I just like to look better. There you go. Now, let's talk about the light meter. The light meter is sort of the exact opposite of the histogram. So rather than reading reflective light, light meters read what's called incident light. And what that means is it literally reads the light that hits the subject. So the way you measure with the light meter is that you hold up the light meter in front of whatever it is that you're photographing, let's say a face, for example, and you know, and that's where the measurement takes place. And I have a light meter here. In fact, that's the light meter I use all the time. It's a Sekonic L308X. It's quite a simple light meter. I've used it for years. It's, you know, it's nothing special. It has a few useful functions that I'll talk about in a second, but I use it predominantly when I shoot with artificial light. So, you know, studio strobes, for example. I find it extremely useful. It's great. I'll go into why I prefer to use a light meter rather than just eyeball it in a minute. But yeah, it's a very simple light meter. The way you would normally measure that is basically in front of the face. So some people like to measure under the chin. Some people like to measure in front of the face or the forehead. That's completely, you know, that's personal preference. I guess I tend to measure somewhere around here. And all you do is you basically point the lumisphere, which is this white ball thing. You just point it at the camera. You know, you press a button, fire the flash. It takes a reading. It tells you, you know, it tells you what your settings are at this, or should be at this particular point, in order to get an accurate exposure. What the light meter actually does is it gives you a readout of what shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture should be in order to get an accurate exposure. You essentially set two of those parameters, and the light meter will basically tell you what the third one is. It's usually the aperture. So, and then you just simply adapt the flash power to that, and you know, Bob's your uncle. And I don't really like the term correct exposure. I don't really think there's such a thing as a correct exposure. The correct exposure is basically the exposure that you feel is creatively right for what it is that you're trying to create. From a technical perspective, you know, a light meter can get you to a good starting point. That can be perfect, or you might want to adjust it from there, but at least you're right there. It's not even so much as a ballpark. It's pretty much there. You just then adjust certain things. You know, it's especially useful for portraits, headshots, all of that kind of stuff. It works really quite well. This light meter, although it's relatively simple, can still do a number of really useful things. Not only can it measure the power of your flash, but you can also measure things like ambient light. You can, in fact, measure reflective light as well by just simply moving the lumisphere to the side. So you could do things like you could measure, you know, lighting ratios, for example. You know, if you have multiple lights set up, You could basically measure, the power of each individual light and then work out what your lighting ratio is, or adjust each light accordingly depending on what it is that you want to achieve. But you can also use it in scene mode, so you can make measurements that would be useful if you're shooting video, for example. Things like that. It would, it would take into account your frames per second and all the rest of it. So it's quite a useful thing. I think the biggest thing for me, though, in using a light meter is simply the fact that it's fast. When you're working with clients, you don't really have time to waste, and just taking one or two measurements and being ready to shoot is worth its weight in gold, basically. I think if you're eyeballing it, then you're just taking test shot after test shot, and you're trying to dial things in, and it just takes so much more time. It also looks really quite unprofessional. I think that's the one thing I like about light meters, is that it makes you look like you know what you're doing. That's the thing. And the final method of making sure you get a good exposure is what I call eyeballing. Basically, you take a shot, you look at the back of your screen, or you look into in your EVF, and you sort of guesstimate that that's what it should look like. There are a number of major drawbacks with that. One is, and this is probably the biggest drawback, is that you can't really rely on the screen on the back of your camera, because depending on what brightness that's set to, depending on what the lighting conditions are, you can't really get an accurate, reading of the image. It might look good on the back of the screen, and then as soon as you load it up on your computer, it's completely out. That's happened to me so many times. Especially when it comes to street photography. That's one of the drawbacks of shooting with a mirrorless camera, for me anyway, is that I think it looks awesome on the back of the screen. As soon as I've got it on a computer, I'm like, oh man, that's by far not as good as I thought it was going to be. I think that's a major drawback. It's also a really slow method, because you're constantly, taking, test shot, and you're adjusting something, and taking another test shot, and really, you can't really rely on any of that. You just end up with lots of surprises in editing, and who wants that? So anyway, but if that is what you prefer to do, maybe you just can't be asked to, use one of those, get in touch, let us know. That'd be super interesting. Or maybe you've never actually used one of those and you'd like to try. In that case, get in touch, and maybe we'll do a longer episode on how to use one of those in action. But it'd be really interesting to hear from you, to see what you think. Do you think it's worth purchasing one of those, or do you think it's a waste of money? You can just do it, using the histogram and the built-in light meter in your camera. It'd be really interesting to hear your side of the story and how you prefer to shoot. Do you mix and match? Some people do. I do all the time. So what else has been happening in the world of photography? Well, the biggest news today, I think, has probably been the newly announced iPhone 14 Pro and the Pro Max, and the fact that they finally ditched the notch. There's also been an upgrade to the main camera, which we'll talk about. The iPhone 14 Pro is a 6.1 inch, or has a 6.1 inch screen. The Pro Max is a 6.7 inch screen, so slightly bigger. And they have a new dynamic island notification system. So they got rid of the notch and doing it slightly differently, and an upgraded, get this, 48 megapixel main camera. 48 megapixel on the phone. Who would have thought? So the new main camera is actually, it's a 3-lens array. So you get 48 megapixel out of the main camera. The sensor itself also features a quad pixel array, and is overall 65% larger than the iPhone 13 Pro. So bigger sensor, better quality. The other improvement has been in the low light department. So apparently the new main camera is now up to 3 times better than the iPhone 13. The ultra wide camera is up to 2 times better, and the telephoto camera is up to 2 times better on the true depth camera. The interesting thing about this is what they're saying is that the photonic engine enables this dramatic increase in quality by applying deep fusion earlier in the imaging process to deliver extraordinary detail, preserve subtle textures, provide better color, and so on. I have seen some sample images, and I have to say, It's really quite impressive. Never thought I would say that, but yeah, it looks good. So Apple say they've also redesigned the flash with what they call a new adaptive True Tone flash, which is an array of 9 LEDs that change the pattern according to the focal length. So that could be quite interesting. It'd be interesting to see what the results of that is. It comes with a whole bunch of computational photography modes, including night mode, smart HDR4, portrait mode with portrait lighting, night mode and portrait photos. The video camera comes with a new action mode, which offers more stabilization. Could be an interesting thing. And there's also a cinematic mode, which allows you to shoot 4K at 30 or 24 frames per second. I'd like to see the some examples of that, but that could indeed be quite interesting. Maybe next time I just film this whole podcast on an iPhone. Why not? So the iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max have basically gotten rid of the notch and improved the camera. Is that enough for you to upgrade? I don't know. I'll be sticking with my iPhone for a little while longer, I think. But enough about phones. There's something else on the horizon that could be quite interesting, provided you have the necessary spare change, and that is Hasselblad's new X2D 100C. It's a 100 megapixel camera with IBIS and hybrid AF. It's Hasselblad's new flagship medium format camera, and it features a 100 megapixel backside illuminated sensor, face detection, hybrid autofocus, in-body image stabilization, and a 15 stops of dynamic range with 16-bit color. They say it's the next generation mirrorless medium format camera. But it looks interesting. Let's put it this way: it looks like a Hasselblad. It has 294 face detection autofocus points for rapid focusing. It shoots in RAW and JPEG. Although I want to see somebody shoot just JPEGs with Hasselblad. Why not? It's not really the fastest camera I've ever seen. It can shoot 3.3 frames per second in 14-bit color. And it slows down when you set to 16-bit color. So it's not for you sports shooters out there, I guess. Now, it does, however, feature a 5-axis in-body stabilization IBIS system that's capable of 7 stops of stabilization. It's not bad. It allows the camera to be handheld, even in relatively low light situations, and still produce pretty sharp images. So it's what you kind of expect for a retail price of $8,200. So if you've got that little spare change lying around, then maybe the Hasselblad is the camera for you, unless you're into Leicas, but there you go. Take up a job in dentistry, and the new Hasselblad or Leica might be the right choice for you. So that's it. We've come to the end of Camera Shake Podcast, episode 119. Bit of a shorter episode this week, but we'll be back next week with an extra long session. We've got a guest on the show, and we'll be talking photography show and everything that's coming up there. Loads of goodness, obviously, that we're expecting there. Should be super interesting. If you can make it, hopefully we'll see you there. Come and say hello. Otherwise, make sure you follow us on Facebook with a Camera Shake Podcast group. Follow us there, or say hello on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all that good stuff. Anyway, see you then.